Thank you very much, Christopher. Great to be here. We will continue to explore the world, the market, and the politics in a post-tobacco world. And now we will, of course, focus on risk and opportunity outlook on the nicotine market. As Christopher said, my name is Henrik von Sydow. I'm actually a global strategist at Carnegie Investment Bank. Carnegie is a leading analysis house for Nordic market and Nordic equities, also Nordic powerhouse of tech IPO, and also leading private banking actor in Sweden. Very happy to host this panel, moderating a great panel. With us today, we have Erik Blomqvist. He's a nicotine institutional investor, also investor relation consultant, also global thought leader on trends connected to nicotine products. Erik is joining us online from London. In this panel, we also have my dear colleague Niklas Ekman, equity research analyst at Carnegie, covering, amongst other, Swedish Match, also involved in the IPO of Hype, which is, well, we actually know Hype since they was in the panel before. IPO on Nasdaq Stockholm Wednesday, so very timely and very relevant for the discussion as well. There is a plan for the upcoming 45 minutes. We will discuss actually three things. First, the innovators, then the investors, and also thirdly, the regulators. And from that, we will try to draw some conclusion and forecast who are winners and losers the years ahead of us on the nicotine markets. And there has been a lot of definitions during the discussions today. We will focus on nicotine products, mainly to nicotine pouches, potentially also to snus and synthetic nicotine. And of course, we might also briefly touch on other harm reduction alternative to tobacco, including e-cigarettes. Erik, let me start with a little bit of a global outlook since you're joining us. First, I would like to ask the question if you are agreeing on the narrative today that we are moving towards a post-tobacco society, and if that's the case, how would you describe the market potential for nicotine product from a global perspective? Erik.
Yeah, thank you, Henrik. I absolutely believe that we're moving to a post-smoking environment, and that's simply because the consumers want that, and they recognize, obviously, there are tremendous advantages to using a product that doesn't, if you use it long enough and hard enough, make you terribly sick. And so with the advent of products like nicotine vapor, with snus, which has its fantastic epidemiological history, and then other products like heated tobacco, you now have viable alternatives to the cigarette. And of course, that market is massive. Roughly 4.8 trillion cigarettes consumed in 2020. That's a market worth over $700 billion at retail. And as was noted in earlier panels, it's about 1.1 billion consumers who are smoking. And you've got roughly another couple hundred million who are using rather nasty and harmful smokeless products like Gutka. So it's a huge market. There's a lot of opportunity. And I think the consumer is recognizing that there are alternatives that provide what they want, but with radically lower risk. And that's the key to these products taking over time and displacing smoking.
And Niklas, if you put it in a Nordic perspective or European perspective, can you elaborate on what are the differences for market potential when it comes to different geographies? More Swedish snus-like product in Northern and more e-cigarette perhaps in US and UK, or?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. Generally, you have a couple of markets where oral tobacco have a historical background, where there's a lot of usage of oral tobacco, where nicotine pouches and snus have been very popular. They've been instrumental into reducing smoking or cigarette smoking. We see in Sweden and Norway, for instance, have by far the lowest levels of smoking incidents, and also particularly in Sweden, where migration to snus has been ongoing for decades, you see by far the lowest levels of smoking-related related morbidity. So clearly there's a strong harm reduction angle here that is related to switching to nicotine pouches and to snus. In terms of which markets have the greatest potential, I think still we're seeing the strongest growth rates in markets like Sweden and Norway. Very, very strong growth in the US market as well, where nicotine pouches have really taken off and opened up the market for a lot of consumers that normally would not consume oral tobacco, that are shifting to this segment as it's perceived to be much cleaner, more neat. It's available to customers that don't really find dip or moist snuff or chewing tobacco very appealing. So it's opening up for new users to use these kind of products. In other parts of Europe, a little bit less so. I think there particularly you're seeing e-cigarettes and vaping. They don't have the same historical background of using oral tobacco. And I would say particularly Southern Europe, the reception seems to have been fairly poor or fairly lackluster so far. So far this has been mainly a kind of Scandinavian and US phenomena. But it's starting to catch up.
Yeah. If we stay in Europe and US, most established tobacco segments have an almost oligopoly-like structure in nearly all markets, but nicotine pouches are still very fragmented. Can this persist or will it become more consolidated over time?
I think it's bound to become more consolidated. Tobacco industry in general is very consolidated, and right now because there's the entry barriers are almost non-existent because of the absence of regulation. It opens up for a lot of small players to enter. But if you look at the market shares, if you look at the distribution, it's very much restricted still to the big players. And most likely we're going to see a lot of these small players either disappear or they will be acquired. But right now there's over 20 different producers of nicotine pouches. That used to be 3 4 years ago. So it's growing very rapidly, but most likely you're going to see a consolidation. And if you look at the kind of the 90% of the consumption is still within the top 3 players, basically.
Interesting. If we just stay at the small players and this innovation-driven process, Eric, where would you say from a global perspective, who are the most powerful actors that actually drive innovation on the field? And if we compare it to major tobacco, big tobacco, with new actors, can you elaborate a little bit on the different agenda when it comes to the innovation processes? Eric?
Sure. There are clearly different agendas, different incentives. You can break it into 3 broad groups. One are the state-owned cigarette companies, such as the aforementioned CNTC, in a previous panel. Then you have the publicly listed companies that primarily still sell cigarettes and who have publicly stated their interest in transitioning to lower risk products. And then you have the innovators who are pure plays on either nicotine vaping products or nicotine pouches that of course are interested in disrupting this very comfortable oligopoly. And so as we progress forward, the state cigarette companies really have no interest whatsoever because of their relationships with governments. It doesn't appear they're going to be under pressure very soon or very quickly. With respect to the publicly listed cigarette companies, there is a varying degree of commitment, at least as evidenced by their numbers and where they're spending the money, toward the innovation. Within the Tobacco Transformation Index, which is a very useful product, you can find ratios of the amount of money spent on high risk, i.e. smoking or combustible products, relative to reduced risk or very low risk products, what the ratio of what's spent on M&A and also on R&D. And this helps you understand where the companies are actually putting the money and where they're investing for the future. And unsurprisingly, companies like Swedish Match and Philip Morris, who have been most vocal and most publicly committed to lower risk products, are furthest along. As far as the small players, I think they're constrained to a degree by the market that they operate in, by the primary markets that they're looking at, and then by the regulatory stance within those countries. can they innovate quickly? So in the United States, for a while, it appeared that it was quite easy to offer new products and to iterate those through depending on consumer interest. That, of course, has changed, and we'll come on to that later. So to me, there's a lot of people willing to do the innovation. Of course, China, you've got a couple of the key nicotine vaping companies who've done a nice job, but that's constrained by then their end markets. So it's a bit of a balance in my view.
Very interesting. Follow up on that question. How would you describe, you briefly touched on it, but how would you describe the startup scene? And if I'm an investor that wants to find the new Tesla on the nicotine market, where should I have my eyes?
Well, I can respond to that first. I mean, I think the two companies that have listed recently out of China, Snore Innovation and Relax Technology, are really interesting. Snore because it's addressing the global market, Relax because it's a play on the transition within China. But those have been also volatile because you have a wide mix of investors. A lot of institutional investors have not yet gotten involved in size, and a lot is held privately. So they're harder to get excited about in terms of the uncertainty of the shareholder base, but ultimately they're nice plays on where they should be at the forefront of the innovation curve, given where they're at and what they're doing and who they're serving in the market.
Okay, thank you, Eric. If we take the Tesla question to Nordic market and Europe, Niklas, where have you your eyes?
There's no real Tesla, but I mean, if you look at the U.S. market, for instance, you have ZYN that has kind of become the clear market leader in for nicotine pouches. Even now, with competition increasing, they still have, and with significant price competition, you still have more than 2/3 of the market that they are controlling, with very tough competition from the big players. But in Europe, or in the Nordics, it's kind of the other way around. In the Nordics, ZYN is falling behind, where BAT has really been instrumental in driving the nicotine pouch category and have done so very successfully with their Lift and EPHI brands. You mentioned Hype, of course, that we listened to before. They have, of course, been the big driver of online sales and have done so very successfully, with market shares of 80-90% in Scandinavia, more than half of the online market in the US that they control. Not sure if the Tesla comparison is entirely accurate, and I think the reason why we're not seeing a Tesla is maybe because the entry barriers are very high. It is very difficult to get the distribution. You need to be a big tobacco company to get the products out in the market. So you can have an innovator that develops a new and exciting product. And ZYN, for starters, that was developed by a small independent company, and then Swedish Match bought the patent, and then others have kind of developed along that way. So it was developed by private innovators, and then it's been adopted by the big tobacco companies. So unfortunately, I think this is a market that's probably still going to be dominated by the big tobacco companies going forward as well.
Okay, if we move from the innovators and market potential and talk, say, some insights about the investors here. Eric, from your perspective, what kind of capital are now being mobilized for the different processes to innovate nicotine products?
Sure. As I mentioned, I think the publicly listed tobacco majors are increasingly focused, and to some varying degrees, on the innovation. They recognize this is not optional, both from a ESG, sustainable investment perspective, but more importantly, their consumers want this, and they have to make this transition. And so it's appropriate for their stakeholders and appropriate for their end consumer. And I think they are putting the money behind the products. If you look at, say, for example, Philip Morris and their heated tobacco, IQOS is in its third or fourth iteration that has actually come to various markets. So they're working quite quickly on a relatively complicated product and bringing those out to provide consumers options. BAT is doing something similarly. You have companies like Imperial Brands and Japan Tobacco, which are less aggressive. They're trying to follow where the markets develop. But all of them recognize that this is a necessary part of their portfolio and are trying to put that money to deploy it properly. I think if one looks at the valuations of various companies, whether ones that have been bought early in the e-cigarette boom, so back in the 2010s, to more recently, again, looking at Smore or Relax Technology, or even a few years ago, the valuation that Juul Labs, the nicotine vaping company in the United States, received, that was tens of billions of dollars that investors were willing to put behind those. Seeing that these products had a compelling consumer offering, were radically lower risk, and therefore had a tremendous addressable market. So I think the capital is there, but it has to be a good story. There have to be some structural advantages that can be there, and then the money will show up once that opportunity is plausible and makes sense. So I think there's a lot, but it is I think it's dependent on how persuasive and robust the story is that is being sold to investors, and does it hold up, particularly given the disappointments in terms of risks that weren't properly understood in companies like Juul Labs.
But do you see any private investors that are interested in investing in innovators on the field?
That's hard. There are some. Again, the Juul Labs experience will have made some people cautious on the venture side. I think, as came out in the previous panel, just the idea of tobacco or nicotine makes a lot of people nervous. I think, as Dr. Sood mentioned earlier, nicotine is widely misunderstood. But it seems to me over time, the fact that you have an opportunity to take over 1 billion people from a tremendously harmful product to one that's radically lower risk that can materially improve their lives, that's a massive win. And what a great story to tell people that we're making their lives better, from day one when they start using this lower risk alternative. But it is a hard sell, given that it's nicotine and it's tarred with, no pun intended, the taint of being related to tobacco.
Niklas, we got the IPO of Hype coming up Wednesday. Investors behind Hype, are they nervous?
I guess there's always some nervousness around IPOs, and particularly in volatile stock markets like we're seeing right now. But generally, this has been a fixed price offer, and interest has been quite high. But it is still more restricted in terms of which type of investors. I've been covering tobacco stocks for the past 15 years. When I started looking at tobacco, we had all the big pension funds were positioned in both in Swedish Match, but also the big international cigarette companies. They have now all left. If you look at the Swedish Nordic investors, none of the big institutional investors, none of the banks, none of the, we heard Danske Bank here before, none of the banks, none of the pension funds have any exposure to tobacco or to nicotine products. And that's changed dramatically, I would say, over the past, particularly the past 5 years, but over the past 15 years, there's been a decrease. So the Hype IPO now, if I look at Swedish Match, for instance, there are no big institutional investors. It's private investors, it's family businesses, and then outside the Nordics, we have a lot of Anglo-Saxon investors involved as well. UK, US hedge funds particularly, but also some of the big institutional investors internationally. But in the Nordics, very difficult. And I would say, we've talked about sustainability here before, and it's very much kind of a binary question. Is this tobacco or not? Is this nicotine or not? And a yes to that basically disqualifies investors from participating. And I think that, to me, suggests that this ESG issue is still relatively immature. I think if people were to scratch the surface, and I'm sure that in a couple of years' time, there will be more granularity in that analysis, that could open up for the harm reduction angle, the same way that investors can put an ESG stamp on Tesla. You should be able to put an ESG stamp on a harm reduction alternative, but at the moment we're not there.
Speaking of ESG, Swedish Match is planning to float its cigars business to focus fully on oral tobacco. Could this open up for investors with ESG restrictions to now actually invest?
I think for some it could, and again, particularly for some international investors that have ESG restrictions, they could do that. I know that there have already been investors that have been restricted in the past that have again started to invest in Swedish Match. Among the Nordic investors, no, I don't think we're there, not yet. And that's from my experience from speaking to investors since this discussion has come up with them selling the cigars a couple of weeks ago, or floating the cigars business. That hasn't led to any material increase in investor focus. So unfortunately, no, it's still tobacco, it's still nicotine, and that is, since it's still a binary question, that still ends up with a no for the vast majority of investors.
Eric, would you just comment on the issue, how you actually touched on it actually, but if you would further development, how resilient is the major capital coming in now? How long is the patient to invest in innovation that actually makes a difference on the market?
Yeah, I think those who are coming into the market now or still hold their positions understand this is not a short-term play. It is something that will take many years. And again, you can see evidence of that in the differing strategies of the international tobacco companies. Philip Morris is looking to transition really as quickly as possible. Imperial Brands, on the other hand, is taking more of a wait-and-see approach and trying to understand where there is real demand for these various products, and in the interim they'll continue to sell combustibles. So for investors who are buying those shares, they understand this isn't going to happen tomorrow, and no, the tobacco or the cigarette majors are not going to stop selling cigarettes because someone else would come in and do it in any way that any company that made that decision would have its executives fired. So I think there is an understanding. The development over time will happen. I think that is certain, but the speed with which it takes place and the variance in the different companies, that is not known. And again, just to highlight the Tobacco Transformation Index, that I think will become a tool that investors use to benchmark at least the publicly listed companies, and then also to understand the environment of saying, look, here are these companies across all these metrics, in particular focused on their reduced risk offerings. What kind of progress are they making every 2 years? Are they doing what they said, or are they in fact just, in effect greenwashing us and telling us what we want to hear, but not actually delivering? And I think that's going to be really important, to be able to benchmark and then understand who's best in class and who is perhaps lagging.
During the afternoon, we've been talking a lot about regulatory risks and also regulatory opportunity. We will soon enter that field as well. But except for the obviously regulatory risks, Niklas, what would you say from an investor mindset? What are other risks for investing in nicotine products?
I guess competition. Normally in tobacco, you have an oligopoly structure, very high taxes, extremely high entry barriers. But when you look at novelty nicotine products, it's it's a much less mature area. Consumers haven't really found which products they want to use, so it's a more open field. So competition, definitely. And so far, consuming nicotine pouches, that's still very much a premium market. There's no discount segment, so nobody has really been competing on price. But as I mentioned before, we have Zyn in the US, for instance. They used to have a 90% market share. That's now gone down to 65% because of the competitors, BAT in particular, being very, very aggressive on price. What could happen there is that you create not just short-term campaigns, but where you land at a lower price level, you create a low price segment that basically destroys the profitability. Normally in tobacco, of course, you have extremely high levels of profitability, and the same is true for nicotine pouches, where margins are 50-60%. If we create a low price segment, maybe margins will be 40 or 30%. So I guess that would be, besides, I mean, the regulatory issues are by far the biggest. But besides that, I would say competition.
Very interesting. And let's move on then to the regulatory issues and start with Eric. Also one question that we touched on, but I want to hear your angle and your perspective on it. What responsible have different actors for what kind of regulation we actually end up with? Go-to-market strategy, advertising, quality of products, etc. What are the responsibility for the different companies?
Yeah, so I think it's primarily the people or entities that are regulating tobacco, or primarily cigarettes at the moment. So it's government and it's the various NGOs that have been instrumental in developing that regulation.
Can we just focus on the industry's own responsibility?
Yeah, so I mean, they have to try and shape that, and I think one of the things that's been interesting is that while the majors are reviled and have a problematic history, they understand tobacco and its where it's been in society, what it's done when used in combustible form, and so they've been reasonably, I think, more responsible in developing marketing approaches that do not, go overboard in terms of trying to attract younger users, trying to attract nicotine-naive people, whereas, of course, those people who are disrupting the market perhaps don't have that perspective of the tobacco companies, don't have the sophisticated regulatory pieces in their business to understand and to be careful in how they're attacking the market. And for them, it's about share and how much can we take from this sleepy, slow tobacco major, which of course can get the whole segment into trouble. And the examples in the United States of the quote-unquote youth epidemic for vaping is one of those.
Yeah, thank you. We have one question coming in here. It's actually to Niklas. Niklas, would you please describe dynamic? What are the main drivers for politicians in the regulatory processes?
The main dynamics for okay.
Yeah, I know that you're not actually, do not have I should be the one commenting on that issue. But from an investor's, from an equity analyst's perspective, how would you describe it?
I think right now the regulatory environment is extremely uncertain. If you look at the European market, in the US it's completely fixed with the FDA deeming regulations that basically prevent any new players from entering. But in Europe, of course, it's an open field where there is no Europe-wide regulation. So I think the regulatory framework here will be decided depending on how the suppliers, or the manufacturers, how they behave, but also how the different countries where nicotine pouches in particular have a strong following, how those markets are locally regulated. As if we see a lot of countries that are adopting amicable regulation, meaning that they tax the products, that they allow them, they put on normal restrictions, like restrictions on maybe avoiding excessive amounts of nicotine or unrealistic flavors or bubblegum flavors or irresponsible marketing. if you see that kind of regulation that is more amicable and reasonable, I think that could pave the way for how the EU decides to they piggyback on the existing regulation in selected countries. And I think that's probably the best case scenario for these companies, that we see regulations starting with individual countries and then the EU adopting a similar EU-wide stance.
There's someone in the audience that wants to put pressure on you, Niklas. This is the question. What is the outlook that the trend and the shift from tobacco to nicotine will be regarded as positive for public health in Europe and the Nordics?
I think you probably need regulators to actually go out and acknowledge this. And at the moment, that is difficult to actually allow these companies to advertise a harm reduction angle. That is something that's very difficult to get regulators to fully embrace. And it's difficult to get politicians to fully back that as well. It's very easy to crack down on tobacco and to crack down on cigarettes as being harmful. It's much more difficult to find politicians that will back the harm reduction angle.
Eric, would you like to comment on that question as well? What is the outlook, the forecast for the politician will look at the development as something positive?
I think Niklas is right. There is a lot of downside for a politician in becoming positive about something with the baggage that nicotine has and the misperceptions around it in terms of the idea that it causes the harm from smoking. I would hope, though, that given you've got something like 20-odd% in the EU of the population, adult population that smokes, that's a sizable minority. And if you can somehow get one's head around the idea that all these people their lives can be materially better off if we can switch them to a lower risk alternative, what a great win for a politician to be able to lead that kind of movement. But it is fraught, and I think a lot of them are focused on the downside rather than the potential upside from acknowledging that opportunity. So I think one should be appropriately cautious about the prospects for an embrace of tobacco harm reduction within the European Union. I think the UK is a nice counterexample where the public health bodies and the NGOs have really embraced the idea that this is possible and this is a good thing. Of course, the UK has far less influence than it used to with the European Union. And so I don't know how much that example will be accepted, but that to me is the beacon of hope in terms of an enlightened policy toward these products.
You almost touched on it, but if you would give a geographical heat map, where are the regulatory risks at highest for nicotine products?
Well, I think the United States, the risk is reasonably well understood. It's particularly difficult to get any new product onto the U.S. market, given FDA's really medical approach to allowing the products to stay on the market. I think the approach of Europe and the UK was far more sensible in terms of setting standards. And then the UK now, that it has endorsed this idea that these products are genuinely lower risk. They've looked at the science, the data support that conclusion. That to me is where there is the opportunity. The US is the most restrictive of the developed markets. And then outside in the lower and middle income countries, of course, WHO is very influential. You've had campaigns by various NGOs supported by Michael Bloomberg's philanthropies that have really been pushing a prohibitionist approach, which again is really disappointing because that's where the majority of the consumers are, and that's where the majority of the smoking harm is coming from. So I would say the United States, and then unfortunately many lower and middle income countries are also taking a prohibitionist approach.
If we move to the European Union and specific nicotine pouches, which we heard during the day, is far entirely unregulated. What kind of regulation can you see behind the corner? What is upcoming, and what can actually manufacturer do to influence it?
I think what we discussed before, that there is no EU-wide regulation, but individual countries are starting to regulate the product. And it's particularly in countries like Sweden and Norway, where the products have gained significant traction. And the previous question was about which are maybe the kind of a heat map. I would say a country like Sweden is one of the greenest in that sense, and it's not so much driven by politicians, it's driven by consumers. We have a very large number of consumers that use these products, which actually puts politicians in the other direction, where they have to defend their consumers' rights. So in Sweden, and the same way in Norway, it's very difficult for a politician to go out and make decisions that are against oral tobacco users. But the rest of Europe is kind of in the other corner, where there are a lot of countries that are nervous about what allowing a new nicotine product would do to consumption. Finland is one of those countries where there is, despite the EU ban on snus, you have a very large number of snus users. So the politicians are worried that nicotine pouches would be a kind of a gateway over to using oral tobacco. And I think that's more tricky there, where the regulatory framework could be much more negative. Same thing in Germany, where there's been a big discussion about chewing bags and a ban on chewing bags. I think that's also a market that could prove a little bit more tricky, while the UK market is much more amicable and more open to harm reduction alternatives.
Okay, we've been talking about innovators, investors, and regulators. If we combined these three angles and go in for concluding comments on these things, what is your both forecast here? If we look at the nicotine market, where do we find the upcoming winners? It might be different companies, it might be politicians, it might be consumers. Where do we find the winners?
I think three companies that are maybe the best positioned. I would say Swedish Match is extremely well positioned in the US market with the great first mover advantage they have with the Zyn product. Hype that we listen to, it's a much smaller company, but strong growing and with very high market share in online sales of nicotine pouches. Otherwise, in Europe, if you look at the nicotine pouch and snus market, I would say BAT have been very successful over the last couple of years in gaining a lot of market share and also introducing the products into new markets.
Brilliant ending, Niklas, with equities we like very much. Okay, Eric, please.
Yeah, I think Swedish Match is, I completely agree with Niklas. It's very well positioned. And has a great story with the Zyn and moving that into the United States and converting people who were resistant to snus and particularly to U.S. oral tobacco. The other two I would cite are Philip Morris International. They've made a very public commitment to move beyond tobacco. They are actively shifting their revenue stream away from combustibles. It's over 25% now is non-combustible. And I think that kind of leadership and example is really driving the competitors as well. I mean, no one wants to be left behind. No one wants to be regarded as a laggard. The other company I think is really interesting is Smore. They are an OEM manufacturer for a lot of the nicotine vaping devices. They sit at the center of the technology for nicotine vaping devices. And I think that this is something that has been shown that consumers want. Consumers like the optionality these devices give them. They like the fact that they have different flavors than tobacco or menthol, and they really like that it's radically lower risk. So those three to me are very well positioned going forward.
Great conversation. Thank you so much, both Eric and Niklas. An applaud for both in our panel here. We're ending very much on a high note and also on time. I see that Christopher is entering the scene, so I leave it to you to introduce the next event, which is cocktail hour, I guess.
Yes, thank you very much, Henrik. Thank you for the insight that you managed to get from Eric and Niklas, and thank you for the energy. It's a good way to actually end off today's program and to move on to the drinks. And again, I wish I could send, I have to find some way, Eric, to send you this deadly salt licorice, if it's allowed into the UK nowadays, but that's for you guys. And I would like to say a big thank you to you who have been here with us today, and also to the almost 300 people that followed us. I got the numbers from Brussels Times just now, that followed us during this panel in parallel online, and the over 1,000 that's followed us from time to time during the course of this day. So thank you who watched this online as well. And I hope that you who are online and you who are here today will come back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock when we start this seminar. We have programs out there, and you can find the program on the webpage as well, so that you don't miss any of the discussion about regulation and other things that's interesting that we're going to dive into tomorrow. But now, for us here, there's drinks waiting, and for you who are online, that part you have to solve yourself. So thanks for today, and see you out there.